Welcome back, I'm That Chemist, and today we're going to be deciding which chemicals have the worst reputation. So let's get started. All of these molecules have reputations in their own right, but some of them are definitely worse than others. Think about thioacetone. A lot of chemists talk about thioacetone. It's so infamous because of its potent odor. Now, I personally have smelled thioacetone. I've accidentally made small amounts of it before, and it is as bad as it sounds. Did I have people several buildings over complaining about its smell? No, I did not. But it is one of the worst smells I've ever smelled. Now, there is a channel on YouTube that's made this before, and I'll include a link to that in the description. So thioacetone, does it have a bad reputation? Yep. Everybody talks about thioacetone in the chemistry community. It's pretty bad, but that being said, people will maybe consider working with it. So for that reason, I think we can put thioacetone into A tier. Now let's talk about fentanyl. So fentanyl is a drug, it's an opiate, and it's infamous for being much stronger than your typical opiates like heroin. Fentanyl is infamous, and it's got a bad reputation because it's often a contaminant in street drugs. And because of how potent it is, it could just be a couple grains of it in the drug, and that could be enough to give you an overdose. For this reason, people typically carry around an antidote called naloxone just in case somebody overdoses. It's actually so potent that if somebody's having a severe enough overdose, it's possible that you could get an overdose just from skin contact. Now, this is extremely rare, but it's a possibility. So in first aid training, it's something that's often discussed. Now, that being said, because it's so potent, it can be really good for sedation, and so it's often used during surgery. Fentanyl is pretty awful in terms of having a bad reputation, though, so for that reason, we're going to put it right into S tier. Now, let's talk about carbon dioxide. This is another classic molecule. Everybody's familiar with carbon dioxide. Plays a role in climate change. It's also present in soda, and normally that would be a good thing that we're going to reward, but this time not so much. It's got a great reputation for being in soda. Now, one thing people don't always talk about is how increased CO2 levels when you're working in a small room, for instance, can lead to decreased mental performance. And so this is something that's understood for airplanes, for example. People often talk about likelihood of having a cold, etc. But you could also imagine that the impact on the pilot might be concerning. So CO2 levels in residential settings is something that I think we should probably look into more, especially if we're wanting to perform at our absolute peak. Good ventilation helps mitigate this, but it's not a problem that we've totally overcome. So CO2, it's got a bad reputation, but not as bad as some of the other ones on here. So for that reason, I think we can put it into B tier. If you're writing an angry comment about CO2 right now, I'm not going to read it, so don't bother. Another interesting one is thiomersol, which is a commonly used antiseptic and antifungal compound, and it's often used as a preservative in vaccines. And it's also worth noting that this is the mercury compound that causes concern amongst anti-vaxxers. This might have a bad reputation, but not as bad of a reputation as the anti-vaxxers have. So for that reason, I'm going to put it into F tier, because while it has a bad reputation amongst some communities, it's not too bad overall. But what is really bad overall is PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. This is an example of a PFAS, and it's used as a hydrophobic and a lipophobic surfactant. This could be used, for instance, for waterproofed coatings. It used to be used more frequently, although it now has the designation as a persistent organic pollutant and as a forever chemical. It turns out that it also has toxicity effects, which are of concern due to its historical widespread use. So this is everywhere. If you take like a blood sample from anyone, there's small amounts of it in there. It's a terrible chemical. It's been replaced with other alternatives that people say are better, but we'll see. Oftentimes, the levels of PFAS in samples are underreported due to limitations in existing methodologies, but there are better methods now for analyzing these, and hopefully we'll see widespread adoption of the better techniques moving forward. PFOA can go right into S tier. Adrenochrome. Adrenochrome is formed through the oxidation of adrenaline, and it's been claimed by conspiracy theorists that adrenochrome is harvested from the blood of children. That's quite an odd reputation, other than being a metabolic byproduct of adrenaline. There's not too much else to say about it. Does it have a bad reputation? No, but the people who talk about it do. So again, we have another F tier chemical. Nicotine is another interesting one. So oftentimes people say that nicotine is a carcinogen, and I'm sure many of the viewers watching right now also believe this to be the case. However, nicotine itself isn't carcinogenic. However, frequently people assign carcinogenicity to nicotine, while the primary carcinogenic effect that you see is in tobacco. And this is because there's radioactive isotopes that concentrate in the tobacco plant, and when the tobacco plant is smoked, it also makes polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So while nicotine gets a really bad rap for being a carcinogen, it's not carcinogenic, and the literature has been updated to reflect that. So nicotine doesn't get off scot-free because it is a habit-forming drug, especially in low-release formulations such as cigarettes and vapes. And the salt nicks specifically are concerning because there seems to be more compulsive use with people who vape salt nicks over the previous type of vape, which utilized lower concentrations of nicotine. So nicotine still's got a bad reputation. I think we can put it into B tier because even if it has a bad reputation, a lot of people still use it. Now, phosgene is terrifying. It's so awful that if anybody is working with it, everybody's terrified, and it doesn't have a super deadly smell, but it's so toxic. It's super, super toxic. It was also used as a chemical warfare agent previously, and so for that reason, easy S tier. Now here we have another chemical which gets a lot of attention, and that's CFC11, also known as Freon 11. Freon 11 is an ozone depleter and a potent greenhouse gas. It's also a really good refrigerant, and people used it as a refrigerant until they found out how bad it was for the environment. It's also a really good solvent, and it's occasionally used as a standard for fluorine NMR. But aside from some very specialized uses, it's been completely banned. So for that reason, we can put it into S tier. So I probably didn't make S tier big enough for this episode, and that's okay. We'll have to start being a little bit more harsh here. So let's look at chlorine trifluoride. Chlorine trifluoride is the chemical that gets the reputation of being able to burn sand, set sand on fire. It's one of the strongest oxidizers, and it's extremely dangerous to work with. There's actually a fluorine chemistry channel on YouTube called Fluorine is Great that I'll link to in the description. And this is the lab of Florian Krauss. I know we have several German viewers out there, and most of their content is in German. In fact, they even have a video where they use chlorine trifluoride on a gummy bear, and it just gets completely annihilated. The last thing I have to say about chlorine trifluoride is that it's used in the production of uranium hexafluoride, which is used for enriching uranium. So chlorine trifluoride can go right into A tier. Very scary chemical. Speaking of uranium hexafluoride, why don't we talk about that next? Uranium hexafluoride is a chemical that's used to enrich uranium. And the reason that they can do this is there's two different main isotopes of uranium that people look at, uranium-235 and 238, and they have different densities. And uranium-235 is the one that people convert into nuclear weapons, while 238 is depleted uranium. Because uranium hexafluoride is a volatile solid, if they get it hot enough, it makes it into a gas. And they use these crazy mega centrifuges that are able to enrich the uranium into uranium-235. So it's another one that gets a really bad reputation, and for that reason, we're going to put it right into S tier. Hopefully, if any of you listening have ever enriched uranium, it was only to make nuclear power plants and not nuclear weapons. Here we have picric acid. Picric acid is a really scary chemical because it's super explosive, and we've had stories on the channel before where people have isolated dry picric acid. Not something any of you want to be doing. So it's called picric acid, which if you're familiar with phenols, you might be surprised that this is an acid, but it actually has a pKa of 0.38, which is comparable to the pKa of trifluoroacetic acid. Previously, chemists used to isolate picrate salts of various complexes and organic chemicals even, although this is frowned upon because that is super nitrated. That thing just wants to detonate. So picric acid, especially anhydrous, has a really bad reputation. We'll put it into A tier. Now, monosodium glutamate. Monosodium glutamate is one of my favorite flavors. We have a whole taste receptor specifically for umami where we taste glutamate. It's one of the 21 basic amino acids, and it's a key staple of Asian cuisine. And it's also present in most processed foods, because guess what? It makes it better to eat stuff. In my opinion, MSG is a good secret ingredient to turn a meal that tastes like a 5 out of 10 into an instant 7 out of 10. And if you don't believe me, try cooking with it. It'll definitely work. You can overdo it though, and you don't necessarily want to overdo it, just because it'll ruin the taste of whatever meal. So historically, some people have claimed to have sensitivities to MSG, but the origin of this claim stems from a paper in 1968 in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they coined the term Chinese restaurant syndrome. And apparently this submission was a prank, but some people unironically believe that MSG is something they're allergic to still. Is it something you could be allergic to? Probably not. Does this stem from racism? Maybe. Is it delicious and does it make food taste way better? Heck yes, it is amazing. MSG can go right into F tier because it rocks. Crocodile. This is kind of something that you'd see in the news probably half a decade ago, give or take. And there was all these stories in the news of people shooting up this crazy drug and losing limbs. And this is an analog of morphine. It was previously used in managing pain in Russia and Switzerland, and it's also been used recreationally. Unfortunately, the illicit manufacture of crocodile was often poorly executed, and so when they formulated the drug, they still had a lot of the crude reaction mixture in there, including things such as iodine and phosphorus. And believe it or not, injecting elemental phosphorus into your body is not a good thing to do. So people started shooting up these mixtures, and it ended up destroying parts of their body. So this one has a really bad reputation. Probably it's overstated compared to how bad it actually is. And crocodile starts with a K sound, so we can put it right into C tier. Now, dimethylmercury. I think dimethylmercury has one of the worst reputations of chemicals on here because this has been drilled into me by everyone I've ever met in chemistry. It's an extremely toxic organomercury compound which allegedly has a sweet odor. And when you're taught about it, there's this case in 1997 where Karen Wetterhen, a professor at Dartmouth College, died following an exposure to a few drops of it. She got it on a glove. She was wearing gloves, wearing PPE, but it turns out that the stuff got through the gloves. And as a consequence of her exposure, 10 months later, she died. So dimethylmercury, super duper toxic. We could put dimethylmercury right into S tier. I'm going to move it over so that we have room for more stuff. Paraquat. This is one of the most widely used herbicides, but it's also lethal to humans and other animals, as this acts as an oxidant that interferes with electron transfer, which is an important thing that all living things do. It's also been linked to Parkinson's disease in farm workers. So despite this having a lot of toxicity, it still has widespread use. And we can put it right into A tier because it gets a bad reputation as well. We've been going in order. Let's spice things up a bit. Let's talk about DDT. So DDT is an insecticide which is controversial as a persistent organic pollutant, and it's toxic to many organisms throughout the environment. The issue is it accumulates and it sticks around, and even its metabolites tend to be a little bit toxic. It's so toxic that there's even a limerick about it. A mosquito was said to complain that a chemist had poisoned his brain. The cause of his sore was paradichloroDiphenyl trichloroethane. This is a limerick I always like to recite because it's very easy to remember and it's very amusing, so I hope you enjoyed that. DDT, another really bad one. I think we could probably put this one into A tier as well. White phosphorus. White phosphorus has a really bad reputation. For some reason, it's still allowed to be used as a chemical warfare agent, and it's frequently used to make smoke bombs, as when it reacts with oxygen in the air, it makes phosphorus pentoxide, which is a white smoky solid. It's also used in rounds which are incendiary, and so people can get burned with white phosphorus, but after they get burned, if any of the white phosphorus remains, it causes lots of toxic health effects, and that's because, again, elemental phosphorus, not good for your body, kind of like the crocodile case. So because white phosphorus is stable in water, sometimes chunks of this are stable, and someone will find it a long time later and get exposed to really toxic white phosphorus, which is not great. White phosphorus, right into S tier. Thalidomide. This is another classic that everybody taking organic chemistry is taught about at one point or another. So thalidomide is well known that it was historically used for preventing morning sickness in pregnant women in the late 50s and early 60s. However, its use led to numerous birth defects, which are now known to result from the interconversion of both enantiomers in vivo. They had thought that only one enantiomer was causing birth defects, but it turns out that even if you have the pure enantiomer that doesn't, inside the body it interconverts between enantiomers, and so you end up having toxic effects regardless. So thalidomide gets a really bad reputation. They're kind of trying to recover it and use it for some other applications, but it's got such a bad reputation that we'll have to see if it recovers. Thalidomide can probably go into B tier because it's going to mess up your babies. Diisopropyl ether. It's one of those things that sounds really innocent until you know what it does. It's a good polar solvent, but it forms peroxides more than most other chemicals. So this just reacts with oxygen in the air. It slowly forms extremely sensitive, extremely explosive diisopropyl ether peroxide crystals. And this chemical is even more sensitive than TATP. So this is a really dangerous one. This one gets a really bad reputation. And if you know of anybody who has a bottle of this, make sure they get it sorted out really quick, because if they don't sort it out, it will sort them out. Diisopropyl ether can go into B tier. Now, glyphosate. This is a broad spectrum herbicide and crop desiccant. People have genetically engineered crops to be resistant to it, such as in Roundup Ready soybean, which is made by the infamous Monsanto. Now, while you've heard bad things about this chemical before, the jury is actually out on whether or not it's a carcinogen. Different governing bodies say different things, and best case scenario, it seems to be murky. Oftentimes, court cases go to a jury because it's not a cut and dry case of exposure causing cancer, and so it's really hard to say whether or not it's a carcinogen. It's controversial, but it does have a bad reputation, and because it has a bad reputation, we'll put it into B tier. But let's say someone's working with glyphosate and they're not sure. If someone's working with uranium hexafluoride, they're sure. If someone's drinking dimethylmercury, you're sure. So you might think that this is too low of a placement, but man, dimethylmercury is way more terrifying. Agent Orange. Now, Agent Orange itself isn't too concerning, but it's what Agent Orange is contaminated with that is concerning. So this is a 50-50 mixture of this trichloro and this dichloro species here. And this is a herbicide and defoliant which is infamous for its use during the Vietnam War. Trace contamination by dioxins, and these dioxins caused health effects for millions of people who are exposed to it, as well as their children. So dioxins are awful. Agent Orange has a really bad reputation. This one's another S tier chemical. Hydrogen fluoride. Now, if you've watched Breaking Bad, you're probably assuming we're going to talk about dissolving bodies in bathtubs, but that's not what we're doing. HF can be lethal because it can attack calcium in the body, so this can cause heart failure. HF is awful, however, it's used quite widely in industry as it's the main way that fluorine is introduced into molecules. I have worked with a lot of HF pyridine, where it's 70% HF, 30% pyridine, and the scariest thing is when it fumes and you can feel the texture on your gloves change. If you're ever working with HF, make sure you have a tube of calcium gluconate around to rub on a wound in case you're concerned you get any on you. Now, the scariest thing about HF is that most people actually have access to it through rim cleaner or through other cleaning products that might be available in certain hardware stores. So HF, it has a pretty bad reputation, and I think it probably should go into S tier. Now, BPA. BPA is bisphenol A. It's a monomer in polycarbonates, and it's a weak xenoestrogen, so it somewhat slightly mimics the effect of estrogen in some contexts. So oftentimes you'll see products that say BPA free, and so here we have this carbon, 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 and they've just replaced this with something like a sulfone, which is just a sulfur with 2 oxygens, or they just have a CH2 group there, and they say, oh, it's BPA free. It's like, that is BS. That is basically BPA. It's still a bisphenol. So maybe it's not BPA, but it's BP something, and I'm going to guess that it has similar effects to BPA. Now, are those effects as bad as everyone makes them seem? Maybe not, but at least be honest about it, companies. It's got a bad reputation, but it's one of those things that people act like they care about, but I don't think they actually care about too much. So we'll put it into D tier. Now let's talk about ammonium nitrate. So this one gets a bad rep because it's used in 80% of the explosives that we see in North America. It's cheap. For that reason, it kind of justifies its use. However, it's also used in fertilizers. Now, unless you're doing a lot of farming, you probably shouldn't be keeping big stockpiles of ammonium nitrate around. Otherwise, people might ask questions. And for the most part, as long as it's being safely handled, everything should be fine. There was a recent incident in Lebanon, which was not great. And so that probably gives ammonium nitrate a little bit worse of a reputation. For that reason, I think we could put this also into D tier. Now, sarin. Sarin is super, super toxic. It is an extremely deadly nerve agent, causing death through respiratory paralysis. And unless you get an antidote within 1 to 10 minutes, you're probably screwed. This is considered a weapon of mass destruction. This is the S-est of S tier. Nerve gases are really scary. Ivermectin. Ivermectin is something that has been popular in the news in recent years. It is an anti-parasitic drug that's used for treating several indications in people, including the treatment of parasitic worms and insects. The way it works is by targeting the glutamate-gated chloride channels, and it interferes with invertebrate nerve and muscle cells. Recently, people have spread some misinformation claiming that it could be used to treat the C disease. However, there is nothing to indicate that that actually works. So for that reason, we can put it into E tier. If you're taking it for a legitimate reason, totally fine. But the wound is still sore, so we should put it into E tier just to keep it safe. Mustard gas. Mustard gas is terrifying. When you have a mustard, it's usually like a nitrogen or a sulfur with a CH2CH2Cl. These things are super reactive because the sulfur has electrons that just pop off this chloride, and then that'll alkylate whatever it can. It's also lipophilic, so it can easily get absorbed, and that means it's able to get into the body and cause a lot of damage. So mustard gas has been used as a chemical weapon. It causes both acute and chronic toxicity. It's a chemical blistering agent, and it also causes mutations and cancer. Mustard gas goes right into S tier. So we have 2 left, hydroxychloroquine and ethidium bromide. Ethidium bromide is a chemical that's used for DNA intercalation as a fluorescent tag in DNA gel electrophoresis. It's known to be mutagenic, and people are concerned about how mutagenic it is. I'm not really sure personally if it's as bad as people claim it is, and I think more long-term studies are needed to truly understand the severity of its effects. There are less carcinogenic compounds that can be used, and the amounts that it's used in for staining gels is relatively low. So is it concerning? Yes. Have most of you ever heard of ethidium bromide? Probably not. We can put it into D tier. Hydroxychloroquine. So this is another one that's been talked about in recent years. It's an anti-malarial drug. As long as malaria in the region you're traveling to isn't resistant to chloroquine-type drugs, you can usually use this to prevent yourself from getting malaria. Malaria is no joke. Now, despite what people may claim, it doesn't seem to be effective at treating the C disease. So this one's actually not that bad. We can put it right into F tier. Hopefully this episode's been entertaining. If you have any interesting ideas, please leave a comment down below, and I hope you have a great day.